Good morning. Good morning. Yes. Very often what this is it's a experience of we don't know what we don't know. There's nothing wrong with that.
Dan gave a talk on men's trauma issues, and I was sitting in the audience listening to Dan thinking, man, this is what has been missing in both my world personally and professionally for so many of the men that I've seen over the years.
So it all starts with a short story about the water.
The notion of masculinity and gender and what does it mean to be a man and what kind of rules am I supposed to be following, it kind of all clicked.
What we talk a lot about when thinking about services, when thinking about working with men, like what are the missing pieces, possibly? What we found is focusing on male socialization and the impact of male socialization on the services we deliver and the men in their everyday lives, the water, the internalization of the man rules, and the impact of abuse and trauma that's been perpetrated as well as experienced. And holding both of them simultaneously seems to be very difficult for our society.
When I heard Dan's approach and insights, it got me really excited because there are so many people in treatment that we can affect in a more deep way. His passion is very infectious and inspiring.
So the paradigm, the larger paradigm that I've been trained in, that I've learned, is this one of what's called values-based services. We talk about being gender responsive. We talk about being trauma-informed. We talk about being culturally humble, recovery-oriented, spiritually enriched, and family-centric. And we talk about that in the context of the program, the services, the clients, the staff, and the organization, the whole group. So this is the model that we talk about all the time. Men's integrated treatment, male psychological development, mental health, trauma, and addiction. That this is like a four-legged stool in many ways. Male psychological development, I believe, should be a part of every single course, nobody should leave without understanding gender and psychological development across the spectrum. So this is how I got into this work. How have your ideas of being a man changed since getting into recovery? That was the question I asked. That was the question I asked when, as a senior in college, I discovered gender and recovery at the same time. In many ways, I saw the water unintentionally. I didn't really have a fish come up to me. It just kind of hit me. I was in a sociology of women course, and I'm hearing all this talk about women and women's pain, and we did it like a consciousness-raising group, so we're in circle, and women are talking about rape, and they're talking about all this stuff, and how they're treated on campus. And so I'm getting this at the same time that I'm learning about recovery. So when I walk into my first recovery support meeting, a man tries to hug me. This is 23 years ago. And a man tries to hug me. And I didn't know if I should punch him in the face or if I should just lean into it and collapse. I didn't do either. But I also know that I was a little preppy, spoiled kid from suburban Maryland, and I'm in Southern Virginia, where we had these ideas and biases about the people living in that small town. And I go to that meeting, and halfway through the meeting, this guy, Bud, starts talking. And Bud had walked into the meeting earlier, and Bud had a white stained t-shirt, and he had a hat that said, "Honk if you love tits." And he's coming into the meeting, and I'm immediately judging that man. I'm immediately cutting him down. I'm immediately knowing that I'm better than he is. And halfway through that meeting, Bud starts talking about how afraid he is. And Bud starts talking about how hard of a time he's having in his relationship and that he might have to move out again. And I am like, WTF is going on here? See, that's when I saw the water, because I was like, what? How are men expressing themselves? And so then I did my master's research, and I started every interview I did for my master's research with that same question. I wrote A Man's Way Through the 12 Steps, and I asked that same question to every man, over 60 men. And you know what the number one answer was that I got from men about how have your ideas of being a man changed since getting into recovery? Guess what the number one answer was? To feel, to ask for help. No, the number one answer was they haven't. That is the water. Because nobody got trained on male psychological development, which means nobody talked about male psychological development, which means nobody put their recovery in the context of male psychological development. So if you're dying, if you're killing yourself, and somebody says, hey, you don't want to die, you don't want to lose your marriage, you don't want to lose your job, you really need to start asking for help and talking about feelings. You got basically two choices. So that's what we do, and that's what we give to men, but there's something that shifts when we put it in the context of male socialization, of the man rules. And what changes is very powerful.
When I heard the man rules, it resonated with me and my beliefs and my practices, not only on an individual level, but on a professional level. It's kind of like a light bulb went off. We weren't addressing men's needs at all in our treatment approach.
Because this was a huge part of the water that I saw. What I saw was everything we ask men to do in therapy and recovery is almost fundamentally opposed to who we ask them to be as men. Don't cry, cry and grieve. Don't show feelings other than anger, learn how to be in touch with your feelings. Don't be vulnerable, be vulnerable. Don't ask for help, ask for help. And over and over and over again. And when I come into a treatment or when I come into a program, how long have I been living by the rules? My whole life, too long. How long am I living by these principles? Give me a year of recovery. Give me 3 years of recovery. Give me 5 years of recovery. What's the default going to be? What's the muscle I've spent all my time strengthening? The man rules. The man rules. And over again, we see this with men. And so what we see is a lot of amazing programs that are creating safe spaces in the program. Sometimes. But think about this. If this is safety, what is this? Vulnerability or threat. Unsafe. Safe, unsafe. We are immediately putting men in an experience of not feeling safe. Whether they can communicate it or not, it's an unsafe environment. Now, oftentimes they'll find safety. But we have to think about the fact that we don't point this out to them. We don't ask them to say this.
It's not that the client is failing treatment, we're failing the men that we're commissioned to work with.
We don't often see it. So part of
And one
what
of the
we're
things
really
that we
needing to
hear are statements like, oh my God, nobody ever talked about this with me before. Nobody ever gave me permission to talk about my sexuality.
So part of what we're really needing to look at is that if we want to be trauma-informed, we have to acknowledge that this is an unsafe situation. And then let's say the men find safety in our programs. Where are they going after our programs? Into a community that reinforces this and doesn't value this. Have we prepared them for that? Have we prepared them? I call it the rubber band effect. The rubber band effect is we basically take men in these fairly rigid rules, and in treatment and in therapy, we give them the permission to stretch them, right? And they're going through our services, and they're in therapy, and they're doing all this amazing work, and they're stretching, and they've got more room, and then they leave our services. And what happens? Snaps back. Porn, steroids, working out, gotta get laid, all of it, all this stuff. Not to mention, they're living in a space that says they're powerless over this substance that has basically been trying to create a life for them. Now we've taken it away. We've put this other stuff in place that we're now saying is not safe. And we're asking them to not do it once. You don't do it once. You do it over and over and over and over and over. And at 22 years, I can tell you, it's still not the default for me. The default for me is not to ask for help. The default for me is not to be vulnerable. The default for me is not to cry. A lot of my work when it comes to looking at men in the water also focuses on shame and trauma. And if shame and trauma are part of the water, it's what gets in the way of us being able to see ourselves, each other clearly. It gets in the way of us being able to really understand our experiences. It makes the water very murky. Now, hopefully we can get to a point where we raise boys where that's not the default. The hard wiring is not that. Male psychological development matters. It really matters if we understand that and how we support people and how we are able to effectively support them in the community and when they move on. Their hardest work is still, I don't care if you have them for a year, their hardest work is still ahead of them. How are we preparing them for that? How are we preparing them to go back into a home that is pissed? That doesn't really care about a man getting in touch with his feelings or being vulnerable. I just want you to stop using and clean up all the goddamn mess that you made. Is that safe? Is that going to support sobriety or recovery? Maybe not. There's plenty of suffering in this world to go around. We don't need to prolong it and have it be protracted for men because we failed to give them the services they need, because we failed to talk to them about their deepest pain, that we failed to create safe places for them to truly discover who they are.
Because ultimately what we're talking about here is people's lives. And if we can do that and do it effectively, we're going to change not just our little communities, but I think the country and hopefully even farther.